The CNN studio lights burned with intensity as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat with calm composure in her chair, her striking red blazer creating a vivid contrast against the deep blue backdrop. Opposite her sat Alan Dershowitz, the legendary Harvard law professor, leaning forward with his face tense and etched with frustration. The debate on presidential immunity had already been heated, but what unfolded next stunned everyone watching. Dershowitz's tone dripped with condescension as he mocked her grasp of constitutional law, declaring that her understanding was embarrassingly basic, and even questioning which law school had given her a degree, since they clearly had failed to teach her the fundamentals of presidential powers. The studio went silent as the host's eyes widened and the audience held its breath. Crockett remained still for a moment, not flinching, before a faint smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. Calmly, she reached for her briefcase, retrieved a document, and addressed him with deliberate confidence. She told him she had been hoping he would go down that path, then held up the paper and warned that what she possessed might haunt him for the rest of his career. What happened in the next few minutes left Dershowitz speechless, the host frozen in disbelief, and legal experts across the nation frantically messaging one another as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. This was no longer a mere political dispute, but a turning point where Jasmine Crockett redefined who in America could rightfully be called an expert. Alan Dershowitz had been a dominant voice in American legal circles for more than 50 years. At 85 years old, the former Harvard professor had represented figures ranging from O.J. Simpson to Donald Trump. His books filled law libraries. His opinions had shaped generations of legal thought, and his presence carried the weight of unquestioned authority. On this night, he appeared on CNN's special legal panel to weigh in on presidential immunity, a subject where his controversial interpretations had sparked headlines for decades. Wearing his trademark glasses and navy suit, he exuded the confidence of a man who had never faced serious challenges to his expertise. Facing him across the table was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, 43, a rising star within the Democratic Party. Before her election to Congress, she had built a reputation as a civil rights attorney in Texas, representing clients in high-profile police brutality cases. With degrees from Rhodes College and the University of Houston Law Center, she had practiced law for over 15 years before stepping into the political arena. The clash between her and Dershowitz had been brewing for weeks. On earlier programs, he had brushed aside her arguments without ever engaging their substance, repeatedly interrupting her and addressing her only as Congresswoman rather than Attorney Crockett, a subtle yet intentional attempt to minimize her legal authority. For the millions watching, this was not merely a technical legal debate, but a battle over who had the right to define expertise in America's most urgent constitutional discussions. It was the entrenched old guard fighting to preserve its hold, and a new generation demanding recognition and a place at the table. Veteran CNN journalist Michael Santiago, known for his measured moderation, set the stage for this confrontation. He introduced the evening's topic as the Supreme Court's impending ruling on presidential immunity, a case with profound consequences for American democracy. He turned to Professor first, reminding the audience that Dershowitz had long argued presidents should enjoy broad immunity, before noting that Congresswoman Crockett had called for stricter limitations. With the cameras rolling and the nation watching, Santiago said with deliberate weight that the debate would begin with Professor Dershowitz. Dershowitz straightened his tie and prepared to deliver his well-rehearsed opening statement, unaware that this night would soon turn into one of the most difficult moments of his long career. He began with authority, explaining that the Constitution grants the president unique powers as the chief executive, and that without broad immunity the office could not function effectively. Every decision, he argued, would be paralyzed by the looming threat of prosecution from political rivals. Crockett sat patiently, her pen moving across the page as she took notes, her expression calm but focused. When her turn came, she responded with precision, acknowledging Professor's long career, while firmly disagreeing with his conclusions. She reminded the panel that the Constitution is built on the principle that no individual is above the law and warned that complete immunity would in effect create an American king, precisely what the founders had fought to prevent. The professor's face hardened at her words. He was not accustomed to being challenged so directly. With a sharp tone, he told her that she was confusing immunity from prosecution with being above the law, insisting these were entirely separate concepts and calling it basic constitutional theory. Crockett did not flinch. She looked at him evenly and replied that she was fully aware of the distinction, but that functional immunity must have limits, especially when it comes to actions outside official duties. The host, Michael Santiago, leaned in and pressed the matter further, reminding the professor that he had previously argued a president might still be immune for actions that brought personal political gain and asked him to clarify that position. Dershowitz shifted forward with confidence, explaining that if a president believed their re-election served the national interest, then actions taken in pursuit of that goal could reasonably be considered part of official duties. He described the matter as complex, but reminded everyone that he had written extensively on the subject. Crockett shook her head ever so slightly, and with a measured voice pointed out that his argument was extraordinary because it nullified the very idea of accountability. By his logic, she explained, a president could order the Justice Department to arrest political opponents and then shield themselves with claims of immunity. The professor snapped back in frustration, calling her example a ridiculous exaggeration. Dershowitz snapped, the color rising in his face as he declared that no serious legal scholar would interpret his position in the way Crockett had suggested. But Crockett countered with sharp precision, reminding him that many respected scholars had in fact criticized that very implication in his writings, and that she could cite several law review articles published in just the past year alone. The host, sensing the tension climbing to dangerous heights, attempted to redirect by steering the conversation back to the specific case before the Supreme Court and asking the professor for his prediction on the ruling. Yet Dershowitz refused to move on, instead turning directly to Crockett, his voice sharpening as he leaned into his credentials. He reminded her that he had taught constitutional law at Harvard for 5 decades and argued before the Supreme Court 17 times, insisting that compared to her limited years as a local attorney, he clearly understood the nuances of presidential immunity better than a flicker of determination, not anger, crossed Crockett's face. She calmly reminded him that her so-called few years included representing clients before the Supreme Court as well, and that legal expertise was not measured solely by Harvard affiliations. She emphasized that the strength of the legal system comes from diverse perspectives. The professor gave a dismissive laugh and condescended that perspectives may matter in politics, but constitutional law was about established precedent, not opinion. Crockett countered that the law is always evolving, and that even originalists on the court recognize that new precedents and interpretations shift understanding over time. The tension in the studio became suffocating as camera operators exchanged glances, and producer whispered urgently in the host's earpiece, advising a commercial break. But Michael Santiago ignored it. He knew this was television that could not be interrupted. Dershowitz leaned forward, removed his glasses, and launched his sharpest attack yet. He told Crockett she was a politician now, not a practicing attorney, and that her role was to represent her constituents, not to lecture someone who had literally written the textbook still used by law students across America. The control room fell silent, recognizing the line between debate and personal attack had been crossed. The host opened his mouth to intervene, but Crockett raised her hand ever so slightly, signaling that she wanted to respond. Her voice was calm but unyielding as she pointed out that he repeatedly invoked Harvard as if it were the sole measure of legal authority, reminding him that many Supreme Court justices had never taught there. His face reddened as he snapped that he wasn't claiming Harvard was the only credential, only that decades of specialized expertise counted for something. Crockett agreed, then cut back with a piercing question. When was the last time he had personally represented a client in trial court? The air grew heavy as everyone realized the professor had not handled a trial in years, instead focusing on appeals, consulting, and commentary. Before he could respond, Crockett continued, explaining that her experience representing ordinary Americans against a stacked system gave her insights unavailable from a position of privilege. That word struck him like a dart. Privilege. He straightened in his chair, finger raised, his voice rising as he warned her not to lecture him about privilege. He insisted that everything he had achieved came from hard work and scholarship, not identity politics. The implication of his words was obvious to everyone watching. The host looked stricken, aware they were now teetering on dangerous ground. Crockett's expression remained steady, though her tone sharpened as she asked if he was suggesting her career advances came from identity politics rather than merit. He insisted that in today's climate certain backgrounds were elevated regardless of qualifications, and that was simply reality. Crockett nodded slowly, as though the professor had confirmed what she had long suspected. She pressed him directly. Was her law degree, her years of practice, and her case record all secondary to demographic advantages in his eyes? He backpedaled, claiming he had not said that about her specifically, but she refused to let him escape. She declared that what he was truly doing was questioning her legal credentials simply because she disagreed with him, and that was not scholarship but arrogance. The professor's face flushed a deeper red as the conversation slipped from his control. He asked with disdain where she had earned her law degree, and when she answered Houston, he scoffed that it was a fine regional school, but hardly in the league of Harvard. That was the moment Crockett reached for her briefcase. With calm precision, she pulled out a folder, her composure a striking contrast to his agitation. She told him she had been hoping he would go there, and that this was no longer about constitutional interpretation for him, but about credentials and who had the right to speak. She opened the folder and laid a document on the table. It was her complete legal resume. 15 years of practice before entering Congress, over 200 cases tried, 7 appearances before appellate courts, 2 before the Supreme Court, and a 92% success rate. The professor glanced at it but refused to pick it up, muttering that it was an impressive record for a local Texas attorney, but irrelevant to the complexity of constitutional theory. Crockett's voice grew firmer as she told him she was not finished. She produced another document and laid it before him. It was the amicus brief she had authored in Martin v. Texas, a case where the Supreme Court had directly cited her arguments, and Justice Kagan had even described her reasoning as particularly illuminating on questions of executive authority. For the first time, the professor shifted uncomfortably, having not known of her involvement in that landmark ruling. Crockett pressed forward, unveiling yet another paper, a peer-reviewed article she had published in the Columbia Law Review on the limits of executive privilege, a topic directly connected to their debate. The host leaned forward, astonished, and admitted he had not been aware of her scholarship. Crockett looked up and said evenly that yes, her work had been published not only there, but in the Harvard Law Review as well. Crockett slid another document across the table, her voice steady as she explained that this piece from 3 years earlier examined the historical precedent of presidential immunity and had been published in the Harvard Law Review itself. Dershowitz stared at the article with visible surprise, unable to conceal his reaction. Publishing in his own institution's most prestigious journal was no small accomplishment, and the realization that Crockett had done so unsettled him. But Crockett was not finished. Since the professor seemed fixated on her education, she pulled out one final document and placed it deliberately in front of him. It was her academic record from the University of Houston Law Center, showing that she had graduated summa cum laude in the top 2% of her class. Below that was her score from the Texas bar exam, which ranked in the top 1% that year. The camera zoomed in on the professor's face as he glanced at the document, and his expression shifted to a mix of surprise and reluctant recognition that he had severely underestimated his opponent. And finally, Crockett unfolded a newspaper clipping and set it before him. It was from the Harvard Crimson, dated 2017, an article on guest lecturers in constitutional law. She pointed out a familiar name listed among them, her own. The host leaned forward in disbelief and asked if it was true. Crockett answered simply that yes, she had been invited by Professor Lawrence Tribe to guest lecture at Harvard Law on civil rights litigation. In fact, she added, she and Dershowitz had been on campus the same week, though they had never crossed paths. The studio fell into stunned silence. The revelation that she had lectured at Harvard Law, his own intellectual home turf, changed the entire dynamic. It wasn't only that her credentials were impressive. It was that they extended into the very spaces he'd used to belittle her. Dershowitz cleared his throat awkwardly and admitted that he had not been aware of her lecture, adding that while Lawrence Tribe was a distinguished colleague, they often disagreed. Crockett seized a moment, reminding him that disagreement among distinguished legal minds is healthy, but it should never involve questioning another's fundamental qualifications or their.